Hello everyone, hope you're doing well. I think today it's time to talk about the F-15, something that I've been wanting to do for a few weeks thanks to a Patreon question. We did actually talk about the F-15 the other day, talking about its operators and also some of the other people that are involved in it, but the main thing to understand is what the F-15 is. Now, the title of the video is pretty simple. Would the F-15 break War Thunder? And the answer is yes, because what it actually did in real life is break the way that many people actually saw the function of combat in the air, or the air superiority role when it first came out in the 70s. One of the things that happened before the 70s, and by the way, there's a bunch of different videos on this which are very good. I'll link a bunch of them in the description of it. But before the F-15 came out, of course you had stuff like the F-4 and also the F-5. The F-4 was seen as the new poster boy of air combat. It was going to be the thing which would take over the skies and kind of reimagine and rechange all of the thoughts that people had towards air-to-air combat, because it had the utilization of all of the missiles. The F-4 Phantom was basically just a bus which had access to a ton of armament, and that was seen as enough because you now had radars getting involved, you now had better missiles getting involved, and everybody just thought that was going to be the future. The high-speed, interceptor role was going to be what was needed, not just to take out bombers, but also to take out stuff like fighters, because you could just attack them from range. There was a problem with this, though. Vietnam happened, and Vietnam kind of showed that this didn't really work with the F-4, and the F-4 actually suffered quite a lot, because the idea of the F-4 was simple. Find out targets way before you could properly see them through the radar, and then after seeing them on the radar, use missiles to try and hit them from a far away, and then move off. So instead of getting into gun range, instead of having to dogfight, that's what you would end up doing. There was a few issues with this, though. The radar wasn't good enough to detect enemies or, anything like that from a good enough range. They started using the AIM-4s, which we don't have in the game for a reason, because they had to actually hit the target in order to detonate, which isn't great. They had a very, very poor percentage when it came to actual, strikes on them. And then also at the same time, once they had to get in close to be able to attack the enemies, they didn't really have any guns because they were more designed around the missile idea. So what ended up happening is they had to retrofit a bunch of F-4s to try and deal with these issues. So they added countermeasures, they added obviously the gun on stuff like the F-4E, they added better missiles, better radars, and eventually the vehicles started coming around. But it was still based around that standard idea of a big truck with a lot of fuel which could get to the zone and annihilate stuff. And then the Soviets brought in something which was kind of nuts. Something that we've talked about previously in the world, and after Vietnam came, of course, the MiG-25. Now, the MiG-25 was kind of an anomaly. A lot of people didn't know a ton about it, and all they saw was it was breaking a bunch of speed records, and also, at the same time, just seemed like a dominant vehicle. Now, there's something to be said about when one side is seen to have a dominant vehicle. What it does is it wakes up the other, and if you have a look at the Cold War and how it was all set up, what you have is a situation of America and the USSR just going at each other over and over again. Even during like the Vietnam era, MiG-21s versus F-4s. MiG-21s were better in certain ways, F-4s were better in others. Then obviously during the Korea War, you had the MiGs versus, of course, the Sabres, the dogfighting duels, which was better in which situation, yada, yada, yada. And you had this all the way through until about the 70s, when America took over. And the reason they took over is actually the MiG-25. Now, why is that? Basically, because of the fact that so many people had massively over-evaluated what the MiG-25 was able to do in terms of maneuverability, speed, weaponry, pretty much everything, because that was what the propaganda was coming out of the USSR. America really knuckled down and went hard on creating the F-15, which became the best air superiority fighter that there probably has ever been especially at the time. When you think about the F-15, you think about the fact that it has, multi-role capabilities, but the early versions of it were pretty much completely designed around the air superiority role, and that's exactly what it did. It blew everything out of the water. The MiG-25 was able to break pretty much every record that was available. The F-15 came along just a little bit later and blew every single record out by even 25% in some cases, which just shows how powerful of a vehicle it was. When they tested the prototype against the F4, it annihilated it. When they tested it against the F5, it annihilated it. This thing was a true evolution if you have a look at aircraft and what they were able to do. And it is all thanks to the MiG-25 and the beliefs around the vehicle. Now, would an F-15 or would a similar vehicle come along anyway? Yes, of course. But the main thing is the actual scramble to be able to get it ready and get it raring to go would have been something that can only be seen during, of course, that era, and worrying about the fact that they had nothing that could compete with the MiG-25. Now, as we all know, in history, a MiG-25 defected to Japan, and then once it was checked, it turned out it wasn't the wonder machine that everybody thought it was. The propaganda on the machine was incredibly powerful, and the only thing it could really do well is go in a straight line really fast. But the problem with that is it couldn't go in a straight line really fast for very long. The missiles were pretty much temperamental. The engines themselves did not have a long service life either, and also it was made of incredibly heavy materials, meaning that it was actually double the weight of an F-15 Eagle. So this idea of agility, because people saw the large wings and were like, oh, it's going to swoop around the air, but it turns out it needed those wings to be able to take off and lift off, and that was about it. If it went past like 3.5 or 4 G's overload, the wings would just break and everything would fall apart once it was tested. The F-15 could do double this amount of overload and also double the amount of many other things. With access to the Vulcan and also access to Sidewinders and semi-actives, this thing just became the dominant force in the sky, and even to this day is still dominant in a lot of areas. It literally has basically 800 air kills to 0 downs in combat, showing how powerful this thing is. There are so many variants of it, and many of them are still in service today. It is just absolutely nuts when you think about this vehicle. The fact that it is over 50 years old at its eldest variant, and nearly 50 years old when it comes to its introduction into service, and it is still one of the most powerful vehicles in the world. It reminds me of a lot of top MBTs, where most of their ideas were formed in the 1980s, but now we have the 2020 versions nearly 40 years on, and even though they've changed quite a lot, they're still the core of what made them so great in the 1980s and also 1990s. The primary users of the F-15 are the US Air Force, the Japanese Air Self-Defense Force, the Royal Saudi Air Force, and of course the Israeli Air Force as well. F-15s were used in many different places, many different combat areas, and also at the same time, they were also parked in Germany, or at least West Germany at the time, meaning that maybe you could get a German one. Talking about the game, what you're going to end up with is a bunch of different F-15s across the way. The only nations really not really having a claim to it are, of course, China and USSR. This thing, once it gets added into the game, will take over it, just like a lot of other vehicles have in the past, such as the F-14 and also many others. It'll be a crazy day once this vehicle turns up, and hopefully people will enjoy it. But there will be no competition for this thing unless they severely gimp it, which unfortunately they probably will do. This is the future of War Thunder. These vehicles just taking over everything, annihilating stuff as they come around, and not really having a competition. There's a reason why we call America the world hegemon, with the largest economy, the largest 2 militaries, and also the best technology in the world. And War Thunder, even today, sees that, but in the future, it's going to take over. As always, I hope you have a wonderful day, and I'll see you next time. I'd just like to thank Brendan Quinn, Vilneus, Character Fuel, Juan the Panda, Carrion Crow, Gus Irenicus, Pyman, Merciless Reaper, Orange Tail, Teddy, Daniel Stanton, Moxie, B. Young, Bareen, Peter Grayling, Alan Hacker, Sem Alslan, Uncle Bean, and Derek R., and also Lafouche for supporting the channel.